In Victorian England, corsets were a daily part of life. Girls started wearing them as early as age 4 or 5. By 12, many were already tight lacing. That means pulling the waist in by several inches. The goal was 16 inches. Sometimes even less. A T-saucer was wider. Corsets were not fashion statements. They were expectations. They were rules stitched into fabric. Most were made of cotton. Some had silk linings. The firmest ones included whalebone, steel, or both. Young girls didn't question them. They were told it was normal. So it became normal. A corset had to be worn during the day. Sometimes even at night. Sleeping in one was considered proper. Mothers tightened the laces. Sometimes nurses did. The girls stood still, arms raised, breathing slowly. There was a ritual to it. Pull. Breathe. Hold. And then another pull. Each tug reduced the waistline. Each knot reinforced discipline. Each sigh reminded them to remain quiet. The corset taught posture. But also stillness. And stillness became the measure of femininity. Some corsets had back lacing. Others had front clasps. But tightness always came from behind. It was easier if someone else pulled. Harder if you did it yourself. But doing it alone was rarely allowed. Waist measurements were monitored. 15 inches was admirable. 13 was astonishing. The smaller the waist, the higher the praise. Even if it hurt. Especially if it hurt. Fainting was common. Women collapsed in parlors, in churches, at meals. It was called delicacy. But it was compression. Breathlessness masked as grace. Collapse redefined as elegance. Doctors issued warnings. They spoke of displaced organs. Of bruised ribs and twisted spines. They called it corset lung. A flattening of the lower lobes. A restriction of breath over time. But their warnings were ignored. Fashion mattered more than function. And a tight silhouette was more convincing than science. There were corsets for every occasion. For day wear. For evening. Even for pregnancy. A maternity corset laced gently at the belly. But it still pressed the back. It was believed to keep the figure from widening too much. Children wore corsets to train their posture. To prevent sagging. To prepare them for womanhood. Etiquette books recommended them. Dressmakers advertised them. Society demanded them. A corset was rarely questioned. It was seen as essential. Like shoes, or soap, or silence. Not wearing one meant carelessness. Laziness. Or rebellion. Tight lacing became a competition. Girls compared waist sizes. Mothers compared daughters. Corsets made the body uniform. But also fragile. Bone shifted to accommodate the garment. X-rays would later reveal the damage. Rib cages narrowed unnaturally. Livers moved downward. Some women experienced chronic pain. Stomach issues. Constipation from constant pressure. Digestion slowed. Appetite dulled. But weight loss was considered a benefit. Corsets forced small bites. Soft food. Long meals in silence. A proper lady didn't rush. She chewed delicately. She barely breathed. Over time, women adapted. The pain dulled. The silence deepened. They learned how to sit with ribs bruised. How to climb stairs without fainting. How to cough without drawing attention. Fainting couches were real. They existed in many homes. Low and long, with one raised end for the head. They weren't luxury. They were necessity. Because collapse was inevitable. A corset could be beautiful. Laced with ribbon. Trimmed with lace. But beauty didn't reduce the pressure. The ribs didn't know it was silk. The lungs didn't care about embroidery. Some women secretly loosened them at night. Just for an hour. Just to breathe fully once again. Others endured the tightness even in sleep. To avoid expanding during dreams. To maintain discipline through the night. Some corsets were locked. With keys held by husbands. Or mothers. There were stories of corsets sewn shut. To prevent temptation. To ensure morality. The corset was not a garment. It was an ideology. Worn daily, enforced quietly. It whispered a message into every breath. Be less. Take up less space. Even the sound of the corset mattered. The soft creak of whalebone. The faint rustle under dresses. It reminded women of their limits. Of their boundaries. Of their silence. Social class influenced corsets too. Wealthier women wore stiffer ones. With custom fittings and embroidery. Poorer women wore second-hand corsets. Already shaped by someone else's body. Already strained, already frayed. Servants laced their mistresses each morning. Sometimes tightening with resentment. Sometimes with care. Mothers trained daughters. Daughters trained their breath. Breath trained their silence. When women grew pregnant, they adjusted. Some removed corsets for a while. Others didn't. There were even corsets made for children. Small. Pliable. Yet just as confining. Entire generations grew up never knowing their true posture. Their true breath. Their true shape. And still, the corset remained. Adored. Defended. Expected. Some women said they liked their corsets. They said it helped their confidence. That it made them stand tall and feel secure. But it was a trained kind of confidence. The kind that came from conformity. From obeying quiet expectations. Corsets shaped the body. But also the identity. They defined what was acceptable and what was not. A woman who wore hers properly was admired. A woman who didn't was whispered about. She was letting herself go. Fashion plates in women's magazines showed the ideal figure. An hourglass with no room for breath. No room for softness. These drawings were impossible, yet expected. And corsets tried to match them. 1 inch at a time. The laces didn't just close the garment. They closed opportunity. They narrowed possibility. It was said a tight waist was the mark of a good wife. A good mother. A respectable woman. Corsets weren't just worn. They were inherited. Passed from mother to daughter like values. Some corsets had initials sewn inside. Tiny letters. Tucked into the lining, almost invisible. Women grew used to the pressure. They forgot how deep breath felt. They adjusted the way they laughed and cried. Even rest was measured. You rested only in ways that didn't wrinkle the bodice. Didn't crease the dress. Corsets weren't always private. In social circles, waist size was public knowledge. A source of pride. A source of shame. Some corsets were worn for pleasure. But many were worn for permission. Permission to be seen. To be loved. It was believed that without a corset, a woman's body would fall apart. That she would lose her shape, and with it, her dignity. This belief persisted for decades. The corset industry thrived. Advertisements promised elegance, posture, and popularity. Some promised health. Others, husbands. Yet behind those promises was pain. And silence. And discipline disguised as beauty. Not every woman suffered in the same way. But every woman adjusted. Because society did not. There were protests, eventually. Writers and reformers questioned the practice. Quietly, at first. Articles appeared in journals. Poems hinted at breathlessness. Letters to editors grew bolder. But change was slow. Tight lacing persisted. Tradition is hard to loosen. Even when doctors showed X-rays. Even when they published studies. Even when women died from organ collapse. Still, corsets were sold. Still, laces were pulled. Still, the waistline ruled. There was a belief that men liked the look. That men expected it. But few ever wore one to understand. Some tried it once. For novelty. And removed it within minutes. The pain wasn't just physical. It was social. To refuse the corset meant to refuse inclusion. Some women resisted silently, wearing theirs looser, or unlacing when no one was watching. But even then, the imprint remained. The posture. The pause before breathing. Corsets became art pieces in later years. Exhibited in museums. Labeled with tags like Women's Fashion 1850. But those labels couldn't tell the full story. They didn't capture the weight of silence. Or the decades of shallow breath. Even in photographs, the corset's influence remains. The high collar. The narrow waist. The hands folded neatly in the lap. The corset taught more than posture. It taught stillness. And submission. The corset was not just clothing. It was a quiet command. Repeated daily. Obeyed without words. By the early 1900s, things began to shift. New garments emerged. More flexible. Less punishing. The girdle arrived. Looser, but with the same idea. Control, reshaped. Some celebrated the change. Others feared it. The loss of structure felt dangerous. Corsets didn't disappear overnight. They lingered. In closets. In expectations. In habits. Even now, their memory remains. In body shapers. In beauty standards. In the way women cross their legs. In the way they sit upright in interviews. In the phrase, "suck it in." The corset, in its purest form, is gone. But the world it built still breathes in whispers. There were corsets for mourning. They were dyed black, lined with satin and trimmed with restraint. They were worn during funerals, during grief, during long periods of expected sadness. Even in sorrow, the waist remained small. Pain didn't excuse looseness. Loss didn't loosen laces. Corsets marked stages of life. Girlhood. Marriage. Motherhood. Widowhood. Each with its own silhouette. In some families, corsets were repaired by hand. Stitched again and again. Passed down like heirlooms, but heavier. Some were patched with cloth from old dresses. Or lined with handwritten notes tucked inside. Messages only the wearer knew about. Corsets bore the imprint of their owner. Pressed into the fabric over time. Invisible, but permanent. The body adjusted around the corset. But the corset never adjusted to the body. It demanded conformity. Without compromise. Many women lived their entire lives inside one. From first tightening to final breath. It became part of them. Posture became muscle memory. Stillness became instinct. Quiet became identity. Even when corsets fell out of fashion, the echoes remained. In gestures. In rules. In habits. The phrase, tight-laced, survived. It came to mean proper. Strict. Controlled. Its roots were not metaphor. They were material. Corsets traveled across oceans. From England to America. From Europe to colonies abroad. Everywhere they went, they reshaped people. Not just their bodies, but their roles, routines, and reputations. Instruction manuals taught how to lace them. How to stand while lacing. How to smile through discomfort. Illustrations showed the correct form. Back straight. Chin level. Breath shallow. Heart hidden. Mothers practiced on their daughters. Sisters helped each other. Friends gave advice, tighter here, looser there. Corsets could be elegant. Intricate embroidery. Tiny pearl buttons. But elegance never removed the pressure. A woman might own just one. Worn every day until it frayed. Still, she wore it. Even working-class women wore them. Despite the labor. Despite the heat. Corsets under factory uniforms. Corsets beneath aprons. Corsets at sewing tables and under market shawls. Some fainted at work. No one asked why. They simply stood again. Newspapers rarely discussed the pain. They spoke of fashion. Of morality. Of control. The corset was both armor and cage. Both protection and prison. Both beauty and burden. Few garments held so much power. So much expectation. So much silence. The laces held more than fabric. They held emotion. They held generations of stillness. Even the sound of loosening a corset could bring relief. A moment of breath. A pause in performance. But loosening it too much was dangerous. It invited judgment. It invited questions. Why did she take it off? Why so early? What does it mean? So many left them on. Through headaches. Through heat. Through hunger. Not all corsets hurt. But all of them held. And holding, in time, became the point. Some corsets were burned. Quietly. In acts of private rebellion. Others were folded and stored. Wrapped in tissue. Placed in drawers with dried lavender. And some were buried. Still laced. Still beautiful. Still unforgiving. Some corsets were never removed. They became part of the body. Like skin, but stitched. The fabric softened over time. But the purpose never did. Even a worn corset demanded posture. In the quiet of bedrooms, women exhaled as best they could. Even sighs were shallow. Some women spoke to their corsets. They gave them names. Tiny whispers, jokes shared in secret. Because the corset knew their shape. Knew their sadness. Knew their silence better than anyone. On cold mornings, the metal clasps felt sharp against bare skin. A small jolt before the day began. Dressing took time. Layer after layer. But it began with the corset. Everything else, the petticoats, the skirts, the bodice, all depended on that first, constricting step. Like building a house on tight foundation. The corset was hidden, but central. Invisible, but vital. Always first. Always necessary. Even the sound of the laces being pulled became familiar. A soft hiss. A breath caught. A final tug. When they laughed carefully. With shallow breath and tilted head. Because too much movement hurt. Even dancing had rules. Not just rhythm, but spacing, angle, grace. The corset shaped how joy moved. Some learned how to bend without creasing. How to nod without cracking the boning. How to sleep in a half-breathing state. Not all resisted. Some embraced it. Or convinced themselves they did. Because resisting meant questioning. And questioning meant standing out. And standing out was its own kind of pain. Some believed corsets taught strength. Not the loud kind. But the silent kind, the kind worn under clothes. Letters from the time describe discomfort. But also routine. Each morning begins with a breath, and then less of it. Corset makers called themselves craftsmen. And they were. They measured, stitched, shaped, designed. But what they created was more than fashion. It was a tool. A frame. A mold. Many were proud of their work. of perfect curves and symmetry. They didn't ask how it felt to wear it. The corset was also economy. Factories built around shaping bodies. Women sewing garments that they, too, wore. The irony of it remained quiet. Pain sold as pride. Strain stitched by strained hands. Magazines showed pictures of the ideal woman. Thin waist. High bust. Calm eyes. She never spoke. She only posed. Behind the photo was the corset. Behind the corset was a woman. Behind the woman, a very quiet scream. Yet society never heard it. Because the scream was polite. Contained. Acceptable. The corset was not violent. Not like chains. But it confined just the same. And because it looked beautiful. Its pain was harder to believe. Harder to explain. Many girls felt proud when they first wore one. It meant they were growing up. It meant they were becoming women. But they didn't know what that meant. Not really. Only that breath would cost them something. Still, they smiled in mirrors. Because everyone said they looked lovely. And that mattered more than how it felt. Even now, corsets appear in fashion. At galas. In films. In design. But now, they are choice. Decoration. Costume. Back then, they were not. They were expectation. They were obedience made of cloth. They taught women to fold themselves inward. To tighten what was loose. To disappear just enough. And generation after generation, the corset whispered its quiet message. Be small. Be good. Be still. Corsets did not vanish suddenly. They faded. Like a candle that burns low for hours before it goes out. The change began in small places. In whispers. In discomfort that became too hard to ignore. By the late 1800s, questions started appearing. Not loud. Not angry. Just careful, tired questions. Writers wondered if the corset was healthy. Doctors published gentle warnings. Some women started to listen. The idea of the health corset appeared. It had fewer bones. It allowed a little more air. But the waist still had to stay small. The shape still had to be pleasing. The rules had not yet changed. Then came war. World War I shifted everything. Fashion had to become practical. Women began working in factories. They walked more. They stood more. They moved. And movement does not go well with steel and bone. Corsets loosened. Some were removed. Others were redesigned. Around the 1910s and 1920s, a new shape appeared. The straight figure. It was the opposite of the hourglass. No tight waist. No extreme curves. Just softness. This was called the tafflapper era. Young women wore dresses that hung freely. Some even cut their hair short. They danced, laughed, and breathed. Corsets became optional. Then, less common. Then, outdated. They remained in closets. Some were kept for special occasions. But not for daily life. The girdle replaced the corset for a time. It was stretchy. It held the body, but did not crush it. And still, even the girdle would fade. Replaced by undergarments with more comfort. More flexibility. More air. Feminism helped too. Not always loudly. But steadily. The idea grew that a woman's worth was not measured in inches. Not shaped by fabric. And slowly, society followed. Advertisements changed. Movies changed. The silhouette of the ideal woman changed. There were bumps along the way. Waistlines came and went. New shapes were always in style. But the age of the mandatory corset, that age of laces and fainting, was ending. Some women missed them. They said corsets gave them posture. That corsets made them feel elegant. But posture could be taught in other ways. And elegance, too, could breathe. Corsets were stored away, folded with tissue, kept in drawers like old letters. Some were passed to daughters, not for wearing, but for remembering. Others were thrown away, discarded without ceremony, not because they weren't important, but because the time had passed. And so, after nearly a century of control, the corset let go. It didn't scream. It didn't shatter. It simply loosened. And women, quietly, slowly, began to inhale again. Some corsets were embroidered with initials. Not always the wearer's, but sometimes a lover's. Hidden under layers, like a whispered name never spoken aloud. Others had notes sewn into their linings. Little messages, scraps of poetry, pressed against the ribs. Words held tightly, like breath. Corsets weren't only worn for the world to see. They were worn for the mirror. A silent ritual of appearance, posture, and performance. The mirror never blinked. It never softened its gaze. It reflected the waist, but never the weight of expectation. Even conversation changed with a corset on. Speech was slower. Laughter quieter. Words chosen more carefully between breaths. Some women said they thought more clearly when laced. That the stillness helped them think. That restraint brought focus. Others said they forgot who they were under all that structure. That they became a version of themselves, quieter, simpler, shaped. They were unsure where the corset ended and they began. When removed, the corset left behind a mark. Not always on the skin, but in the body's memory. The way the ribs curved, the way the back arched. And in time, even without the laces, the body remembered how to hold itself in. Just in case someone was watching. Unlacing was its own ritual. Not loud. Not rushed. Each loop, each knot, undone with care. Hands moved slowly, not out of weakness, but out of reverence for the silence beneath. Some women paused halfway through, just to feel the air between skin and fabric, just to remember what softness felt like. Removing the corset didn't always mean freedom. At least, not right away. The body needed time to relearn itself. Shoulders had been pulled back for years. Spines had curved against pressure. Even rest had been taught restraint. Some women kept their corsets in drawers. Not out of need, but out of memory. They were not garments anymore. They were ghosts of posture. Folded proof that they had endured something. And sometimes, late at night, they reached for them. Not to wear, but to hold. To feel the stitching. To trace the seams with quiet fingers. As if reading a diary written in thread. No one else knew the language. But the body did. And the corset did. Corsets aged slowly. The boning softened. The fabric thinned. But the structure always held. Even when worn. Even when tired. Like the women who wore them. Stitched together day after day. Pulled tightly, quietly, without complaint. Some corsets bore wear along the seams. A small tear near the hem. A bit of fraying lace no one would see. These small flaws told stories. Of mornings rushed. Of breath held too long. No one ever asked the corset how it felt. And no one ever asked the woman either. They both were expected to hold. To remain firm. To never give way. Corsets weren't discussed in public. Only the shape they created was praised. Never the weight they carried. Even when removed, there was an invisible trace. A line along the skin. A pressure beneath the ribs. A silence behind the smile. And that silence was the most lasting part of all. The corset is gone now. But its echo lingers. Not in pain, but in memory. In old photographs, we still see it. The way women stood. The way they held their breath without thinking. In museums, corsets rest under glass. No longer worn. Just observed. They do not speak. But they do not need to. Their silence is enough. They tell a story without sound. Of posture and patience. Of elegance and endurance. Today, we look back. Not to bring them back. But to understand. To remember the weight of beauty. The cost of shape. The quiet strength behind stillness. Not all corsets were cruel. But they all held something tightly. And now, that grip has softened. The laces are undone. The boning has bent. The breath has returned. And as you lie here now, in this moment, in this softness, no one is measuring your waist. No one is pulling the laces. No one is asking you to be smaller. You are not corseted. You are not shaped. You are simply resting. And as your breath slows, as your body softens, you may still hear the faint sound of silk. But it is no longer a command. It is only a whisper, saying, you are free now. Good night.